So my talk tonight is called People, Property, and Practice, Neighborhood Planning Now in the US. And typically, when I give a lecture about our work, I usually talk about our practice very broadly, kind of explaining the range of topics and projects that we do. Um, some of them touch upon environmental justice and health equity. We have our cooling stations and our sound pods in the South Bronx. We've designed sort of large playscapes for kids. And we've also been working on reimagining infrastructure. We also have our book, The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. But I'm not going to talk about any of that tonight. So those projects are going to be bracketed for today. But I'm going to stick around afterwards, and if anybody wants to ask me any questions, I'm happy to discuss them more. But so for tonight, as Jörg said, I'm going to try to do something different. I'm going to talk about our projects through the lens of reconfiguration. And I'm going to focus mostly on one place, the city of Detroit, where we've been working for almost 20 years. And I hope that by taking a deeper dive into one place over time, we can focus on a smaller set of projects and spaces where we can really observe at the neighborhood scale many different constituencies operating simultaneously, sometimes in conflict. We can take a closer look at how spaces are being made, remade, and transformed by different actors with really different interests, and how in the process radically new types of public space emerge. And I hope that I can reveal something about what's happening in the US today and what our role as architects and planners in it can be, and to kind of set the stage for more conversation and debate. So as Jörg mentioned, I'm a principal and co-founder of Interboro Partners, and my partners, Tobias Armborst, Daniel Dioka, and I, we started our practice almost 20 years ago. That makes me feel really old, in New York City. And the three of us, we actually studied together. We studied urban design and planning together pretty much straight out of grad school in the early 2000s. That's when we started our practice. And the very first thing that we did was a series of competitions that focused on urban subjects that at that time were not really the hot topics in architecture and urban design in the United States. This was in the early 2000s, and the real estate market in places was hot, I would say super inflated. And so at that time, while many of our colleagues were like making new cities in the Middle East and luxury housing developments in Asia, tech towns in Silicon Valley, they were all using the tools of urban design in pro-growth situations. We at Interboro focused on places in the United States that were losing people, losing property value, really focusing on places that were low growth or no growth contexts. But these sites of low growth, no growth communities, they were places where people continued to live and work. And for us at that time, it was really very interesting and challenging to work in these contexts where the traditional tools of development, the typical tools of capital, the tools that we had been trained in grad school, they just didn't work. So we used these early competitions and independent research projects to define what we were and what we continue to be interested in. How people use places, transform them, adjust them to their specific needs, and in the process, make new spaces. How urban form takes on entirely new meaning, even if just temporarily. For example, here, this actually looks like 4 houses, but it's really 2 houses, so focus on one side of the screen here. That's a really interesting kind of visual experience. That's just one image. But actually, it really works, I think, for Detroit. So this is an image from Detroit. So this is actually the space between 2 houses in Detroit. And that space exists because of zoning, because in Detroit you have a like 30 by 100-foot lot and you have a side yard setback. And that's what that space is in between those houses. And here it's being transformed as a shared space between the two properties in preparation for a Bangla wedding. So adjustments and appropriations like this are tactical, right? Along the lines of what Michel de Certeau describes as the tactics of everyday life. And the appropriation of urban space through temporary use becomes really a creative act in that it creates new meaning. So the side yard setback between two standard Detroit homes all of a sudden becomes a space of celebration. So early in our practice, we built a series of experimental temporary public spaces. These are projects that we designed and constructed with very, very small budgets or no budget at all. And because there was little or no budget, we tapped into different flows of materials using techniques of borrowing, bartering, and gift exchange. I would say making something out of almost nothing. And we worked with local arts organizations like the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. We worked with them on Lent Space, which you can see in the upper left. That was a temporary sculpture park on the edge of Soho in Manhattan, where we got the space lent to us. And the trees that were temporarily containerized on the site were planted in the neighborhood afterwards. And Rest Stop, which was a temporary tree grove made entirely out of recycled materials. And after the project, all the materials were reused someplace else. So holding these things, trees and other kinds of stuff, we used it to create some kind of value for locals. It gave access to a site that had been closed to a neighborhood, shade, a place to sit. Commonplace, that was the courtyard for the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, where we borrowed the passerelle from the city of Venice, you know, the temporary sidewalks. We borrowed those and we used them to basically create that courtyard, and then we designed and fabricated those red blocks, which we then gave to playgrounds and schools afterwards. So again, all these materials went someplace afterwards. So recycling and reusing these materials, like of course we care about the environment and had a perspective about sustainability, but really what we were trying to do was to use whatever we could to create a benefit to different communities and publics after our project was over. And we crystallized this approach in our project for holding pattern, which we did for the Museum of Modern Art at PS1 in Queens. We were commissioned to develop a courtyard for MoMA PS1, and this is like, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's kind of like the Serpentine, but for emerging architects, where MoMA would hold a competition and then commission one office to design and build a pavilion for a set of music events that attracted about like 6,000 people every weekend. And this was in summertime. And so it was a temporary project, and like the temporary projects that I had just shown you before, we had already been asking ourselves this question, but it is really the key question for temporary projects. You know, what happens to all the stuff after the project is over? Does it get thrown out? And could we design and build something that could be put to a different use after the event was over? So we looked for the answer just outside. Those are the walls of MoMA PS1 right there. We looked for the answer just outside of MoMA PS1. PS1 is located in Queens. It's just about the most diverse place in New York City, maybe in the United States. And what you see in the foreground here is a little, it's a plaza by taxi drivers who work across the street. And they had a little repair shop for their taxis, and then they had a spot, a place for people to wait with, you know, they had a shade structure and some plastic chairs and tables and a few planters. And we thought this was an interesting space, and it interestingly had the same exact program that the project that we were challenged to work on, which was seating and shade and maybe some planting. So we asked the drivers if they needed anything for this space that we could design for our temporary project and then give it to them afterwards to supplement their more permanent plaza. And then we started asking other neighbors too if they needed anything, like the people across the street. These are a bunch of truckers from a union that was on the other side of the museum. And as a matter of fact, we went around the neighborhood speaking to dozens of people, groups, institutions, simply asking them, is there something that you need that we could design, use in the courtyard during the summer, and then give to you in the fall once the project was over? And so we built all these things that people asked for: chairs and benches, lifeguard stand, chess tables, trees, a lot of trees. And here's a map of where everything went after the project was done. So instead of working for one client, MoMA, we started working for about 50 clients and sites. And so here you can see the taxi drivers receiving some of the furniture that they requested, the tree being planted across the street with the union headquarters. But before all those pieces were delivered, they were stored in this courtyard for the summer under this large kind of lightweight shade structure that we designed. And a lot of people asked for trees, so we got about 85 trees. And we arranged them in this kind of temporary forest in one of the parts, corners of the courtyard. And it was really a nice place to be in over the summer. And you can see each tree had a tag, and it says where it will go after the summer. It's kind of making that visible. And here you can see the kind of the before, the during, and the after of the trees. Another one of our clients was a nonprofit ballet school. They told us that they needed mirrors for the school's expansion, so we got mirrors, and we installed them in this kind of post-minimalist setting. It was very popular selfie spot during the program, during the party. And then the mirrors were installed at the school in the fall. But before we installed them at the school, the ballet school came and did performances in the space of the courtyard as a kind of form of gift exchange. In return for the mirrors, they gave us a number of performances. And so this was really the most important part of the project, because it became a space of interaction and association between these different publics: the museum visitors, the party crowd, but then also the neighbors, the many people who had never set foot in the museum, who came to visit their stuff, their tree, their sandbox. And like the ballet school, many of our partners offered to organize programs in return. We had a senior citizen event, a mixer. We had the New York Irish Center. They did like a quilting event. There were also b-boy workshops with a little bit of aerosol art. And then we also did kind of readings with the Queen's Library. And so we're really bringing people and art into the museum, and at least I would say temporarily turning this into a kind of I would say it's a radically public space. The pieces of architecture here and there, the chair, the mirror, they're not kind of a background setting, but they're really active participants in creating this space of interaction. And there was a kind of, I would say, agency to the stuff. And so this was a really important project for us. With all of the temporary public space projects, we were really trying to direct these resources of the project, our time, the materials, for something that was bigger and longer than the project itself. But with Holding Pattern, we were able to design a temporary site and a process, but that had the potential not only to start this conversation, but to also create potentially new forms of public interactions, new alliances, and perhaps new communities. So now that I've explained these foundations, the competitions, the temporary public space. I want to focus on Detroit. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the first competitions we won was about shrinking cities. Actually, Anka Hagerman is here, who was one of our partners, so thank you so much for coming. From the Shrinking Cities Initiative, Reimagining Urbanism. So that was funded by the German Federal Cultural Foundation and Archbus. So thank you, Germany, for your help. But I need to go back to this competition to tell you about the work that we're doing in Detroit today. So when we first started working in Detroit, we were really playing, I would say that we were kind of playing the role of observers, looking, listening, documenting, not so much as like urban designers or planners, but really like as urban fans. We were really interested in the place and really interested in what people were doing with the place. Detroit, I think most people in this room know, it's a former center of car manufacturing, and with the decline of that sector, it really lost a lot of its population. So in around 1950, the population peaked at like 1.85 million. And then since the 1960s, the population has steadily declined, going down to 640,000 in 2020. But last year, the city gained population for the first time in 60 years. It's now at 645,000. So it lost a lot of people, but still there are a lot of people there. And with that loss of population, the city gained a lot of vacancy. So there were vacant buildings, vacant land, entire neighborhoods that were sparsely populated. And for a long time, there were really these kind of dystopian narratives about the city. They were really, I would say, in vogue in the architecture and urban design community. People would be waxing poetically about, the shrinking city disappearing, reverting to nature, wildlife coming back in. And on the other hand, there were also many visions for re-urbanization. These are like, one kind of like urban renaissance or another. So like traditional new urbanism, or something like in a spectacular OMA kind of flavor. So those two types. But these visions didn't really speak to what was going on the ground. The people that were, what people who were living there, what they were actually doing with their city. Those people who had stayed in Detroit, despite the loss, the population loss, they were absent from these narratives, and they were doing a lot of interesting stuff. I would say, like transforming their properties, taking advantage of Detroit's shrinkage by appropriating, buying and borrowing land adjacent to their homes to build, garages and gardens, to park their cars, park a satellite dish. So because the practice didn't have a name at that time, we called it blotting, and we called the result of blotting a blot. And you can see this, all over the city. And when you look carefully at ownership maps, you'll see very, very often the same person owning the adjacent land. And like I mentioned at the very beginning when I showed the first photograph, Detroit, outside of the downtown, the entire city is, residential, 30 by 100 foot lots with single family homes with enough space for a car. So I guess, in relationship to what we heard earlier today about these kind of regimes of power in Africa, African planning, colonialist planning, like we've got like Fordist slammed down on the ground in Detroit with this kind of grid that was really, very much part of the Fordist system. So those blots, you can see them all over the place. There are basketball blots, trampoline blots, there are accessibility blots, there are symmetrical garden blots, there are big driveway blots, so you can like park your car perpendicular to the home. And so it's very interesting. And so what we did was we kind of told stories of these different families, and this came through interviewing people, but we visualized them. This is the story of the Anderons. their family, over the years, expanded their property to kind of a 6-lot blot, which you can see here. If I had more time, I would get into all the intricate details. Or this is the Turrells. They incrementally expanded their property and also changed the typology of that kind of Detroit house. So it went from being kind of the shotgun house from front to back. Because of those extra lots, they expanded out with this loggia, and then eventually it became this kind of courtyard house with a fence and playground equipment. And so in the early 2000s, when we're working on this, this was really happening at a very large scale throughout the city. And it was, rewriting the city's genetic code in the patterns of land ownership. So you can see that here, where you go from the 30 by 100, and then the houses were abandoned and burnt down. They disappeared. And then people started purchasing the lots next door and making these new and kind of unusually shaped lots. And this was invisible. And it was, at least I would say, it was invisible to the local planning authorities, who were really at that time still following the logic of some kind of high density traditional urbanism. And they saw these practices of people expanding their lots as really like a nuisance, an obstacle to development. So here in this project, we were kind of redefining the specific role that we could take on as urbanists. And in this case, I think we were really operating as ghostwriters by describing and visualizing and naming everyday practices, but also to a certain degree, working to legitimize and advocate for those practices. And over time, the city's planning policy shifted from fighting this kind of informal appropriation, and they started to embrace it. And now what's really incredible is the term blotting is in the common parlance. It's on NPR and other mainstream media. It's now, I've been reviews in Pittsburgh, and people are like, this is my blot. So it's actually a really cool thing that it's something that has become part of the everyday language. Now, in the following years, we've done a number of neighborhood plans and projects in Detroit, including one for Campo Davis in Banglatown. That is a neighborhood, or one could say it's a collection of neighborhoods in northern Detroit. It's really marked by stark discrepancies. In some parts of the neighborhood, it's really very empty. There aren't very many houses. And then other parts, there's a lot of reinvestment, development that's going on, and much of it is driven by the Bangladeshi immigrant community. And so if you look at this map of the planning area, the areas that are white, those are all where there's buildings on the lots, but the areas that have the orange, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, those are areas that have a lot of vacancy. Do I have time? I was looking at this photograph last night, and I was thinking about the conference. This is a photograph in the neighborhood, and it's like a building. And we always use this image, we often use this image to talk about this project, but I think it's so interesting because you see the kind of texture of the wall. You got this Bangladeshi American girl, but then you see the kind of the red and green of the flag of Bangladesh, but then there's this tiger, which is a Bengali tiger, but then in Detroit, we have the Detroit Tigers, which is a sports team that people are really interested in. So I thought it's kind of interesting the way that all of these different ways of looking at the city and about having kind of constructing identity or kind of collapse on the surface of this wall. Anyway, that's just my little segue there. But so, like I said, there's a lot of development in certain parts, which you can see on the right. But then in the western part and the northern parts, it's really marked by a lot of disinvestment and a lot of vacancy. And has street views like this. So a lot of this land is actually owned by the Detroit Land Bank. That's the authority who the land goes to once it's been abandoned by their owners. The owners are not paying taxes, and so then this land goes into the land bank. And what the land bank often does is that they auction the land off to the highest bidder. And this area that we were working in had a really big inventory of land bank properties, but the land bank had put a hold on those land bank properties in our neighborhood area, waiting for the recommendations of our plan. And I want to just make a little note here about the auctions. Since the city or the land bank had been holding them, in recent years, speculators have been buying large tracts of these really cheap parcels just to hold on to them, in the chance that maybe at some point, like someone will do something there and then they'll have some kind of value. But it's really very, very speculative, and they're very bad owners, right? Because they don't like do any maintenance, and so for people who live in the neighborhood, it's really not good. So part of one of the big challenges, or one of the things that we're asked to do by the city was, okay, come up with a recommendation for the land bank because we have all this vacant land. And what we ended up doing, what we ended up recommending actually surprised a lot of people, especially people in the neighborhood, who in many ways had become, I think, a bit, had felt disenfranchised by the process. We tried to upend the city's long-standing process of selling the land to the highest bidder, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. But what I think is also really important to understand is what first seems vacant is sometimes actually in use, which is not immediately visible. So sometimes neighbors would appropriate land through use, as we've seen in the blots. Sometimes they care for them, they mow grass, they clean up trash. And it's this light use and reuse, the boundaries of property, they become blurry, and it's introducing new temporary and sometimes seasonal forms of land tenure. And that was really important to us as we were tasked to come up with a plan to disperse of the city-owned land. And so what we proposed, and actually now the majority of it is city policy, was a patchwork of programs that made it easier for local residents and community organizations to get title to the land. So this is one area of the neighborhood on the western side, and now here you can see it's called East Davison Village, and all these parcels that are shown in the teal, those are owned by the land bank, or they were owned by the land bank when we started our project. And so here are the recommendations we made. The first was we actually suggested that they hold a few strategically located parcels for future green infrastructure projects, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Second, the parcels that at that moment or in the near future could be used by the remaining residents as blots, you know, the land, vacant land adjacent to inhabited homes, we said, okay, that should go to them, that we have that program to do that. And then third, we said, reserve what is currently being stewarded. When someone who doesn't own the land but is taking care of it, they should have the first right of purchase, even if it's for very little money. And then four, the land that remains after all those three other moves happen, they should be combined or bundled together in different size, larger parcels to sell or transfer to organizations that need larger parcels of land. And so here you can see the inventory of all the bundles in the project area. Each bundle has one house in need of renovation. And the thinking behind this was, and I'm going to explain a little bit more what we saw there, but a lot of the residents who lived in the neighborhood, they had actually purchased homes that were in need of repair, and they purchased them because they could afford them. And then over time, they repaired those homes themselves using kind of sweat equity. But the city and other neighborhoods, they had never done kind of facilitated that. They always like would get a whole bunch of houses in a neighborhood, have one developer go through following the kind of Fordist model of like, you know, do all the plumbing, do all the electrical, fix the roof, blah, blah, blah. And so this was a different idea to kind of individualize it. So these bundles, they're actually perfect for institutions Like this one, Bandu Gardens. That's a cooperative of Bengali women. They had a lot of success to actually in their backyards. They had actually grown, they had like little gardens in their backyard, but they actually farmed and sold a lot of the vegetables that they made, and it was really successful. And they eventually, they were able to expand their business, and they set up an industrial kitchen, and they're running a catering business right now. And so they were looking for more land that they could actually expand their farm. Here's another example. This doesn't look really amazing at first, but bear with me. This is New Hope. This is an Islamic community center. It's in an old former commercial structure on one of the main thoroughfares. And starting from this core, the center over time, they bought adjacent vacant land and buildings connected to their kind of nearby their property. And they expanded their program of community activities. And it was really done based on the spaces that became available. So they like did a soccer field, and they had a garden, and they bought a couple houses. And they also turned a bunch of vacant lots into a garden. They actually have a vegetable market. They grow a kind of special kind of Bengali bean that actually does really well in the upper Midwest. And they also teamed up with this kind of local hipster gardener entrepreneur, and they're doing like some kind of like pickling. They have like some kind of pickling enterprise. And then their the parking lot, it actually is the site for one of the city's vegetable markets. But this vegetable market really focuses on fruits and vegetables that you are like good for Bengali cuisine. So we see a kind of important neighborhood node here, a new civic institution that we might say emerged from the combination of a kind of charitable mission to do something good for the neighborhood, right? That's the Hope Center. But then also it's like, on the other hand, there's like this kind of pragmatic of blotting, picking up real estate as it becomes available and finding new ways of putting land to use. And then there are a number of other such emerging institutions, such as Powerhouse. This is a group of artists. They acquired a bunch of properties in the neighborhood, and they turned them into these community spaces within this 3-4 block radius. And they're really interesting. Like they got this one house, typical Detroit house, but then they kind of, and they emptied it out. So it became this kind of theater, and it's used by the local Bengali choir and also by local theater groups. They also did the Ride It Sculpture Park, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a sculpture park that's also a skate park. And it turns out to be quite useful for like a really wide range of constituencies. So yeah, so these community or the bundles are actually really good for these community organizations. So here you can see this whole range of policies, and I'm thinking a little bit about what was said in the kind of the previous panel, where what we tried to do was to really fit these policies within the existing set of policies, but the idea of giving priority to people who are living in a neighborhood, even though that seemed really obvious, it wasn't something that the city had ever done before. And what I'm really proud about is that our stewardship program, that was not legal before. There's no path to doing that, and now it is like one of the most popular programs in the city of Detroit. It's called the Neighborhood Lots Program, where you can actually, it follows the logic of the blots, but it has a different kind of set of conditions, and now it's, people can do it. And so there was a pilot program in one area, and quite successful. I just read the recent report on it, that we have like a kind of 75% success rate in actually something happening. And so these community groups, they have a real stake in the ground, and they benefit from this program. But like I said before, there's this this lighter form of land tenure that's less permanent, characterized by use value, seasonal use, care, maintenance. And this is where the remaining residents, they're actually taking care of land outside of the territory that they already own. And this is, I just want to show you a detail of that. So for example, like Marty, he has a house, he takes care of the lots next to him, but then also across the street. And so this was what our program actually allowed, where people who were taking care of land that was not adjacent to their house, they could then actually acquire it. How do we find out about this? Well, because this kind of tenure light is informal, you can't find it on a map. You can't even like see it the way that you could see a blot. Certainly as a consultant, when you start working for the city, they don't give you a GIS layer that says like stewardship. The only way you can really identify it is by talking to people and acquiring local knowledge in meetings. We had many, many different community meetings, focus groups, smaller meetings such as a women's meeting, model building, game sessions, but we also had conversations in more informal settings. For example, using this ice cream truck that we had doing rounds in the neighborhood over the summer. It doubled as a kind of neighborhood map and a kind of engagement station. It's like, you know, space of conversation. People got ice cream in exchange for sharing their information. And the ice cream truck, it's really a very everyday and ubiquitous piece of urban infrastructure in American cities, particularly in like spread out cities like Detroit, because if you drive a truck down, an ice cream truck down the street, you do the little jingle, people come out. And it's like a great way to kind of connect to others in a spread out city. And I think it was also, it's really useful because it was a way to tap into the knowledge base of people who have zero time to actually turn up at a public community meeting in some kind of like, you know, high school multi-purpose room. We also, what was kind of cool about this was that we actually collaborated with this Yemeni American businessman who actually owned a lot of the ice cream stores, and we worked with his truck painter who hand painted our sign, ice cream, you can plan on it. So anyway, so here's the overall plan. We developed a framework with these three elements: the housing and economic development, open space and community nodes, streetscapes and connectivity. In orange, you can see the bundles. As I mentioned before, we said that we should retain some of these sites for some of the parcels for blue-green infrastructure. We created a cut-through to connect parts of the neighborhood that were disconnected. If you look at the kind of the way that the street grid was developed over time, the area that's in the west that had the most vacancy, it was really cut off from the rest of the urban grid. Community members were always saying like it's a place that really feels abandoned, people don't drive through it, it feels separated, and that's actually because of the way that the street grid was actually ingrained. And then you can see how that evolved over time, but we used some of that vacant land to actually make a cut through so that people could actually move across that grid. And here you can see it, actually the Mead cut through under construction, and it got built. And then another priority project, if you look over on the left, you see that kind of big building on the left side of the screen. Another priority project for the neighborhood was the redevelopment of a vacant school. This is something, the really big problem in the city, that there are so many vacant schools. And we had come up with a couple of different approaches for the redevelopment of that school, and the city really liked it. They liked our approach, and I just want to say one thing about this. And one of the things that we're trying to do in looking at the redevelopment of these schools is that the community members, they really wanted to see something happen, but often because the size of the projects were so big because of the actual number of square feet, we came up with different strategies about how, you know, also thinking in our kind of temporary mindset, how you could activate only part of it or to break the building down into smaller projects so that they could actually get developed with the community members. That was something that we did in that project. The city really liked it. That led us to winning the Detroit Vacant Schools disposition strategy. That's a kind of a mouthful of a name for a title. Not, I didn't come up with it. That's what the city calls it. But it's actually a project in which we creatively assessed and envisioned the futures for nearly 70 decommissioned schools. And this was a really complicated project, really connected to Detroit's shrinking population, but it also included, questions, tough questions about historic preservation, about responsibility, what it means for residents to see a neighborhood landmark literally fall apart. And what was interesting about this, and I'm thinking about the discussion before about Berlin and whether or not anybody can agree on it. In this project, actually, for once, there was huge agreement that something should happen. The mayor agreed on it, the planning department agreed on it, preservationists agreed on it, the police department agreed on it. Everybody thought that there should be a strategy to deal with these 70 vacant schools, but there wasn't really a clear process. And I believe that we actually got this project because we were able to visualize and design a process to get the work done. And I think we succeeded because we were able to tackle the challenge from the scale of the individual room. You can see kindergartens, gymnasiums, to the school building itself. We call this our kind of eye exam diagram of the schools. To the schoolyard, to the neighborhood, to the city and the region. And we were able, again, and I mentioned this before with the first school I showed to you, we were able to develop reuse strategies that synthesized our understanding of the spatial potential of the school spaces, what could happen given our understanding of the condition of the structure, but also an understanding of like the dynamics of the real estate market, and then always working to foreground what community members needed. So in all of these projects, we were always thinking about different ways to actually break the building down into smaller projects so that we could get the buildings back into community members' hands. And also thinking about phasing. So really, we heard a lot of this in the earlier sessions, but really kind of taking an interscalar approach. So we're currently working on another neighborhood framework. This is probably the most complicated and contested yet. It's centered around an existing infrastructure project, which you can see outlined in the green. It's like a highway and a highway interchange. And the larger project is to replace this highway with a boulevard. That highway was built in the 40s and 50s by destroying Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. That's the area that Albert Cobo was pointing to. He was the mayor in the 1950s. He's here with Henry Ford, who is second in the middle and a third person. And these are neighborhoods that were largely destroyed as part of the federally financed mid-century urban renewal program in the United States. Tying it back to Germany again, that neighborhood was destroyed to make way for Mies van der Rohe's and Ludwig Hilbersheimer's Lafayette Park, which are right there. They destroyed that neighborhood to make space for this highway. And here you can see the location of that highway in relationship to the concentration of Black residents at that time. This is an illustration from our book, The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, which I don't have time to talk about today, but make a small reference there. So here you can see a before and after photo of Hastings Street in Paradise Valley. This was the center of Black culture, middle-class life, like really major music center of R&B. This is it before and after highway construction. And like I mentioned, the plan is to turn the highway into a boulevard. There's a kind of like there was a broader ambition to actually reconnect the communities that were divided by the highway. And since the boulevard is so much smaller than the highway, there's actually new land, new parcels that will be created. And so our charge, what Interboro is doing, is to help advise the city about how to subdivide, plan, and actually distribute that excess, what they call excess land. And so the boulevard design is being led by the Michigan Department of Transportation. And there are many different stakeholders here. There are actually, see where it says Greektown? That's actually where there's a whole bunch of casinos there. So kind of like big business, hospitality industry, very kind of empowered, wants to get all of their, their customers in and out via car. We have also to the east Lafayette Park, which is the Mies van der Rohe complex, which actually is, it's very beautiful. It's a wonderful place to live. And everybody who lives there is really concerned about this project, that it's going to impact the urban qualities of their beautiful neighborhood. And then to the north is Eastern Market, which is actually a very successful and important major food distribution hub, and it really depends on having direct highway access. So there are all of these kind of different interests. And then there are the Black Bottom descendants, the relatives of those who lost their neighborhood and their business and their homes. And this group is no longer on the site. It's dispersed all over the region and beyond. And so we're leading a process we're designing a process to try to bring in these different perspectives and interests into the project and use that engagement as the foundation for the recommendations. So who should get that land? That's what I've been working on. So thank you.